Every year around the holidays, it's a tradition in my household to sit down and watch one of my favorite anime, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. This all-American, wink with ding sound effect, I don't think I was supposed to read that part out loud, Rankin Bass classic was originally dreamed up, and you'll never believe this, as an all-American marketing campaign. The 50-minute musical TV special based on the song of the same name was originally aired in 1964 as part of the
General Electric Fantasy Hour,
and provided an avenue for GE to advertise their wonderful, amazing, miraculous products, not just to George and Betty America, but also to little Timmy and Susan, like a clock that looks like a teapot but actually isn't a teapot, but is instead a clock.
It looks like a teapot, but we know it's not.
And in exchange, General Electric funded the production to the tune of a cool $500,000 smackaroons.
General Electric used to add to the cheer.
This was a lot of money for the time, but GE could never have imagined how good a return they would get on that investment, nor could any of its creators have anticipated the absolute cultural phenomenon it would become. At the height of the television era, it quickly became an annual family event, broadcast to millions of viewers every single year for what this year will be 60 years, making it the longest-running, highest-rated television special in the history of the medium. And all of that is thanks to the tireless work of dedicated, mostly invisible creatives who poured their souls into the animagic that brought to life these amalgamations of wood, wool, wires, and leather, and empowered them to brighten my cold, damp, fetid living room every December. Of course, the classic songs,
We work hard all day.
I have to go.
hilarious script,
Why weren't you at elf practice?
You wouldn't mind my red nose?
Not if you don't mind me being a dentist.
and lovely lesson about how differences should be tolerated only if they are useful.
I mean, that nose of yours. That nose.
Huh?
All have major roles to play in its success, but there's just something so uniquely charming about the puppets themselves. Their craftsmanship, the jerky but expressive way they move, even the clever implementation of different techniques to match the qualities of different characters. A mouth could be a piece of wood that hinges at the jaw, a collection of flat, pre-painted pieces of paper to be exchanged frame by frame, or soft wool with a wire inside to make it posable. But when I gaze upon them, I can't help but wonder, what's the story behind these treasures of American culture? Where did they come from? And most importantly, whatever became of them? Where are they now? A question whose answer seemed settled until recently when new evidence flipped the whole thing on its head. Because what follows is a tale of intrigue, propaganda, false identities, both human and puppet, the weaving together of cultures and animation industries from three nations at war with each other, and the forgotten pioneer who made it all possible. At this point, I should mention there is already a video on this site that focuses on the same topic, and it's a good video, but new information has come out since then that actually makes it factually inaccurate, and for the parts that do remain the same, I've tried my best to come at the story from a different angle. I already gave you a hint in the first sentence of this video. I wasn't joking when I called it an anime.
Best place to start is at the very beginning.
Our story begins in Tokyo, 1919, the birth of a baby.
A baby what, Wingo? A baby, Tango?
Named Tadahito Mochinaga. Mochinaga spent most of his childhood in Changchun, China, a city in so-called Manchuria where his father worked for a railway company and which was occupied by Japan at the time. He traveled frequently between Changchun and Saga, Japan. But it was at a theater in Tokyo where he got to see an animated Mickey Mouse short projected when he was 10. Judging by the year, it would have been around 1929, it could have been the original Steamboat Willie cartoon. It was this short, and Walt Disney's silly symphony Water Babies, which he saw later in Osaka after moving back to Japan, that inspired Mochinaga to become an animator himself. After art school, he eventually got a job at Geijutsu Eigasha, or GES, and worked under Mitsuyo Seo on a handful of films. Among them was Ari-chan, a 1941 short film funded by the Department of Education about a young ant who finds a violin in a sandbox, for the production of which Mochinaga built Japan's first ever multiplane camera rig like the one famously used on Bambi, with 4 separate layers that allowed them to create a parallax effect for shots like this one. The influence from Disney is obvious in a way that I don't think I have to explain. Soon though, GES was contracted by the Imperial Navy and Mochinaga did backgrounds, visual effects, and photography for Seo's monumental 1943 film Momotaro's Sea Eagles, a propaganda cartoon in which the popular folklore character Momotaro leads a platoon of cute little animals as they fly across the ocean to triumphantly bomb the absolute pants off those fat, stupid American soldiers at Pearl Harbor. Ironically, at the same time Mochinaga was working on this, his biggest inspiration, Walt Disney, was compelled by the US military to make his own exciting propaganda cartoons like this one.
Guns, guns, all kinds of guns. To blast the aggressors from the seas.
About the deeply held American value of diligently paying your taxes.
Mail it in early. Be one of the first. Just address it to your local collector of internal revenue.
Boy, things have changed. Momotaro's Sea Eagles was a landmark in Japanese animation history and was wildly successful, though it's unclear how much of that success came from the mandatory school outings to go see it, arranged by the Department of Education. Mochinaga regretted his work on it. He wrote in his memoirs, "I heard that many youths volunteered for the Flying Corps, and that while they were on duty they died in air raids. I wonder whether the film we made influenced their decision to volunteer. I thought, in the future I only wished to make a film that would benefit the young, difficult though that may be." It was also advertised as East Asia's first feature-length animated film, which is strange because with a runtime of 37 minutes, it was not feature-length by even the most generous definitions. That honor goes to its sequel from 1945, but by that time the war was almost over and Mochinaga had already returned to China with his family after their home was destroyed in an air raid. He would continue to work on propaganda for some time though, because just 3 months after he started working at Manchurian film studio Man-A, it was taken over by the Soviet Union and subsequently the Chinese Communist Party. He spent 8 more years in China as the studio was renamed and relocated multiple times and worked on several projects under the pseudonym Fang Ming, including eventually directing his own animated short, Thank You Kitty. And there's so much more to say about this time and his role in the history of Chinese animation. I really fell down a research chasm while making this, but that's for a different, more in-depth video only about Mochinaga. Maybe I'll make that one in the future, but for now, this next line in my script has just reminded me that this video is about the Rudolph puppets. Most importantly to our story, he inadvertently popularized stop-motion puppet animation in China. Directed by the prolific leftist actress and filmmaker Chen, Fang Ming, aka Mochinaga, was shown a cartoon that satirized the Chinese Nationalist Party by depicting its leader as a marionette controlled by an American general and tasked with adapting it for film with real puppets. Dealing with an extreme shortage of unexposed film in the country though, he realized that if he stiffened the joints of the puppets, posed them, and shot each frame individually, he could use only the exact number of frames necessary. Mochinaga returned to Japan in 1953, the same year the country began regular television broadcasting. He continued to make stop-motion films with scavenged and reused components just as he had, thus becoming the father of stop-motion puppet animation in both China and Japan. And what had just been a means to save money in China proved desirable and profitable in Japan when he landed a contract to produce a series of commercials for the beer company Asahi. Mochinaga turned down an offer to join Toei Animation, assembled a team of animators, and produced several more stop-motion shorts over the next few years. Once again following in the footsteps of Walt Disney, one of those films, which is unfortunately important to this story, is based on this picture book whose name I won't repeat, and which is still very beloved in Japan. To be fair, at the very least, Mochinaga's puppets are significantly less caricature-ish than the illustrations in the version of the book that was published in Japan, which was really bad. This film traveled to the first ever Vancouver International Film Festival in 1958, where, according to one version of the story, it caught the eye of an American producer named Arthur Rankin Jr., who had just formed a studio with his friend Jules Bass called Videocraft International, which would later be rebranded to Rankin Bass. Rankin himself never mentioned this part of the story, though it's possible he forgot. He did also forget another detail that's critical to the story, which we'll be getting to a little bit later. In 1960, Mochinaga, with the help of 2 other producers, Enosuke Omura and Torizo Matsumoto, created MOM Production, an acronym of the first letters of each of their surnames, set up in a building in Tokyo that had previously been used to test engines for fighter planes, and signed a contract with Videocraft International to produce a series of 130 5-minute episodes of stop-motion puppet animation titled
The New Adventures of Pinocchio.
over the course of a year. This is truly an insane volume of work. If you account for the title cards, that's roughly equivalent to a series of 24 20-minute episodes in a year. For reference, this was 3 years before Tezuka's Astro Boy, which is generally considered to be the first Japanese animated series to be syndicated in the US. Mochinaga was extremely reluctant to take the contract, both because it would completely occupy the entire studio's time for the whole year, and because that labor would be exported to maximize the profits of a foreign company with little to no credit or ownership for him and the scores of people who worked on it. But with debt from earlier productions that needed to be paid, the opportunity was too good to pass up. And after a fire in the studio that set them back significantly toward the end of the Pinocchio production and put them even further in debt, there was little choice but to continue the relationship with Arthur Rankin and Videocraft International. They created 5 more productions for Rankin and Bass, and after Mochinaga left and was succeeded primarily by Hiroshi Tabata, the studio renamed to Video Tokyo Production and would go on to animate every single one of Rankin Bass's stop-motion productions except for their very last one, The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus in 1985. But none was more momentous than their third collaboration, 1964's Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. The team of animators at MOM worked tirelessly to bring to life Rankin Bass's trademarked Animagic technique, which combined frame-by-frame puppet animation with traditional 2D cell animation and various visual effects techniques to create magical things like the falling snow in this scene or the reflection effect in this one. Rankin Bass would record and edit a full audio version in New York and send it to Japan, where the animators could sync to it. They worked excruciatingly long hours, sometimes sleeping by the puppets to get as much animation time as possible. At this time, creative work wasn't always credited as extensively as it is now, and compensation has always been a bit of a crapshoot. For example, the voice of Sam the Snowman, who narrates the special, Burl Ives, who was already very well known at the time, was the only voice actor to be paid significant annual residuals, which his family still receives to this day. The rest of the main cast, including the voice of Rudolph, Billy Mae Richards, seen here with her name spelled wrong in the credits, would get $1,000 each over the next 3 years, which is of course laughable in comparison to the unknowable millions that the special must have brought in over the last 6 decades. Still though, it's important to note specifically that none of these people, who just happen to be on the other side of the world, are credited at all, and they're arguably just as important to the production as the recording engineers. And one other quick aside about the credits while we're here, this guy, Kizo Nagashima, was actually a senior businessman who handled the financial side of the studio and likely had zero creative input whatsoever. In fact, almost all of Rankin Bass's animation was outsourced to Japan, with a slight sprinkling of India, Taiwan, Korea, and the UK tossed in there for a little bit of flavor, and much of their traditional 2D animation was actually done by a company called Topcraft, some of the members of whom would later become original members of Studio Ghibli. And while Rankin and Bass didn't technically hide this fact, they certainly didn't seem to mind if people didn't realize it. Jules Bass, who was more involved in the audio side of things, never went to Japan, but Arthur Rankin Jr. did visit regularly to oversee the animation process. He held the MOM production team in high esteem. They really loved what they were doing. They were such a team of great talent and expertise, and the cooperation between them was amazing. It was a revelation to see the shop where they were making the figures, seeing them hanging on the wall, waiting to get their hair combed out. It was a whole world, a miniature world that existed at that time and probably never will again. And while Mochinaga himself may have much preferred to work on their own original work for a domestic audience rather than exporting their labor to a larger, richer colonial power on the other side of the world for virtually no recognition, Rankin's account about the animators loving their work doesn't seem inaccurate. Ichiro Komuro, also known as Pinchan, the guy who actually physically created the puppets based off the designs from Anthony Peters, seen here with his name spelled wrong in the credits, muses, "Personally, I like Rudolph the best among Rankin Bass shows because it's simply a good movie. It's filled with tenderness and has a heartwarming story to it. I believe Rankin Bass shows made a great contribution to Japanese puppet animation, and I appreciate Mr. Rankin very much. Most of my staff who are working in puppet animation in Japan now had experience and got influenced by Rankin Bass shows. I wish I could work for another show like Rudolph again. I believe many of my colleagues think the same way. And they really did go the extra mile to ensure they were making something they could be proud of." Assistant director and seemingly Mochinaga's right right-hand Hiroshi Tabata recalls, "Rudolph was the best show of all that Mr. Tadahito Mochinaga directed and animated. I remember before we had started the shooting of Rudolph, Mr. Mochinaga and myself took a 10-hour night train from Tokyo to Nara, the old capital near Kyoto, to observe the deer in Nara National Park. There were more than 1,000 wild deer in the park. Our aim was not only to observe the deer's movement for the animation, but also to build up our imagination of Rudolph and the reindeer's world in the bosom of nature. We spent 2 days in the park with the deer, and it was a very valuable trip. The puppets themselves required a great deal of consideration to create too. Puppet creator Ichiro Komuro and his assistant Kyoko Kita have given some details on the choices that had to be made in the process. They carved the characters' heads from the light, soft wood of a katsura tree, hollowing out the inside if they were ever too heavy. Thin-shaved pieces of leather made the pupils to be pasted onto eyeballs, and they would later start using ball joints, which are much harder to manufacture, but for Rudolph, every character was posed with a skeleton of copper or lead wire. Both wires and joints have strengths and weaknesses. A wire could be bent for any part of the puppet, but it's weak and breakable, and in animation, when you bend some part of the puppet, it bends back a bit. Rudolph's nose was a tiny 12-volt light bulb made custom and painted red. Nobody could have known how successful the special would become, but that success was at least in part due to this artistry. Likewise, nobody at the time could have predicted what important treasures the puppets themselves would become, and so no particular effort was put into preserving or keeping track of them, it seems. At least a handful of them were shipped from Japan to the US to be used in publicity photos, to be gifted to stars, and for the previously mentioned buttload of General Electric ads. Rudolph and Santa were put on display by NBC in Rockefeller Plaza from the mid-60s to early 70s before being returned to Rankin Bass Studios along with a few others. For decades, it was a mystery what had become of these puppets, and rumors swirled that they had completely deteriorated or simply been thrown out behind the studio. It wasn't until some 30 years later that it became clear that they had been gifted to Barbara Adams, Rankin Bass's secretary at the time, and then became toys for her niece and nephew. Because in 2005, after the release of official Rankin Bass historian Rick Goldschmidt's book about the production, to which I owe most of the second half of this video, he was contacted by that nephew who said he had found the puppets in his attic. The puppets were built solely for the purpose of animation though, and were never intended to last. After the shooting was over, all the puppets became very much soiled and many parts were broken. They were kept somewhere in storage as it seemed their lives were over, and those puppets were gone somewhere, some years later. They have weathered over the years like any other composition rubber dolls. Take a look in the mirror, we're all falling apart. The figures would last about 16 months, tops. So when that nephew produced the Santa and Rudolph puppets to be appraised on Antiques Roadshow, it was remarkable that they still existed at all, but unsurprising that they had seen better days. Santa's legs and Rudolph's neck were broken, much of the glue had melted, wood had deteriorated, and Rudolph's nose was seemingly replaced with red candle wax, and Santa was missing his eyebrows and half his mustache. The family also apparently had several others, including Yukon Cornelius and Hermie the dentist, but they had melted away in the hot attic. Collector and friend of Rick Goldschmidt, Kevin Kreis, bought the puppets, and the two of them had them certified by Arthur Rankin Jr. and sent them off to be restored to their former glory by LA-based stop-motion studio Screen Novelties. Robin Walsh at Screen Novelties took great care to clean the wool and fabric, restore the integrity of their structures, and craft replacements for any parts that were missing. The process is documented on the Screen Novelties website, which I'll link in the description along with all my other sources. At last, Santa and Rudolph were back after 30 years. They toured TV shows and conventions, changed hands a couple more times, disappeared into one collector's private collection for a while, before a final auction where they had eventually ballooned in value to $367,000, close to 50 times their initial appraisal of about $8,000 on Antiques Roadshow, and resurfaced for display in 2021 thanks to their final anonymous owner at the Center for Puppetry Arts in Atlanta, Georgia, to delight patrons each year. And that was the end. Except, hold on, take a close look at this Santa, and then that one. Doesn't it look just a little bit off? It certainly looks like the same Santa as this one in the publicity photos, but when you put it next to a screenshot from the actual special, the bottom part of the beard looks a little bit too big and round. And in 2017, there was an exhibit about Mochinaga at the Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo, which featured puppets from many of his stop-motion projects, including The Boy and the Tigers from the story that shall not be named, and Santa and Rudolph. That was after the restoration, but before they showed up in Atlanta looking like this. This is not the same Santa. According to this description of the exhibit, the puppets were sourced directly from Mochinaga's family home. MOM Production did sometimes create multiple copies of certain puppets so that they could shoot multiple scenes at the same time, so it's possible that they could have done that with Santa, but the one from the special has these distinctive lines in the beard where Santa's mouth would hinge up and down. That same separation is clearly visible on the Santa from the Mochinaga exhibit, but the American one looks like one big round piece. You can even see that in the appraisal clip before the restoration and after years of being played with as a toy, there doesn't seem to be any separation in the beard for the mouth to hinge at all. Could it be an imposter? J'accuse! Well, the Christmas after that final big auction, Rankin Bass historian Rick Goldschmidt sat down to watch the special again and noticed that discrepancy, as he would write in an article for Remind magazine. Confused, Goldschmidt reached out to producer Masaki Izuka. As it turns out, Arthur Rankin had forgotten about this, but he had actually requested that Komuro and Kita create a completely separate set of puppets. Not for animation at all, but specifically to be sent to New York for publicity photos. The animators were still in production right up until the last minute, so they couldn't use the real ones. Which means the Santa and Rudolph on display in Georgia are not the actual screen-used puppets at all. Still a part of history for sure, but not the ones you see on the screen. Nor were the Hermie and Yukon Cornelius and however many others that melted in that attic. Okay, a really quick addendum here actually, because while I was editing this, I found a post from Styrofoam Kyle on the Craft Your Fandom forum from 2020, pointing out something that even Goldschmidt and Izuka may have missed. While this young Rudolph certainly isn't the main one from the special, it looks like there were in fact two copies. This one, which is used for most of the scenes, and this one, which has some notable features which do actually match up with the one in the publicity photos. Most obviously, a more prominent tuft of darker fur on the top of his head, and one horn that's slanted more dramatically outward. This version only shows up in a couple short scenes in the second half, but it looks like it actually did get screen used at least a tiny bit at some point in the production, even though it's not the main one. You can also notice that he's getting real dirty towards the end there. But the same definitely still goes for Santa. This is not the screen used one. I'm sorry this is confusing. Okay, thank you, bye. Drive safe. The general consensus for a long time has been that there are very few Rankin Bass puppets left in the US because they've all been destroyed or discarded. But the actual truth is that there are very few because very few ever even left Japan, a fact which is still known to seemingly very few people. At the time of recording, even the website for the Center for Puppetry Arts still claims that these are the original puppets from the special. Outsourcing has been a foundational part of animation industries in the US and Japan since very near the beginning, as anyone familiar with the anime industry knows, and it's only gotten easier in an increasingly connected world. But the degree to which MOM production was instrumental to the early development of both industries is severely overlooked. Tadahito Mochinaga died in 1999. He mostly remembered his time in China fondly, despite shortages and difficult working conditions. The same could not be said for his time working with Rankin Bass. He referred to that time as the days of hard battle and bitter fights, which means a lot coming from a guy whose most formative moments were during World War II and the Chinese Civil War. And he went on to warn other animators in China against doing outsourced projects. He didn't want to be a mere source of cheap labor for America, but all the same, he and his team put forward their whole creative energy to not only pave the way for a style of animation that would blur the lines between media in a way nobody had seen before, but also to craft a work of art that they may not have known would leave a mark on the lives of millions of children like myself a world away for decades to come. Some artists just can't help themselves. And while he may have been relegated to the 6th page of credits, a symbol of his contribution, the actual puppets themselves still remember his hands as they sit undisturbed to this day in his family home. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end. I know this is a little different than my usual videos, and it wasn't intended to become an epic that spans an entire century, but as I was researching the story, it ended up just being too fascinating. YouTube can sometimes punish you for trying new things, though, and I spent a ton of time on this one. So if you enjoyed the video, I'd be really grateful if you gave it a like, subscribe if you want more, all the usual stuff, but most importantly, share it with a friend who you think might be interested. Thanks. And a big thank you to my supporters over on Patreon, whose names are hopefully all spelled correctly in the credits. Katie Else, Macintosh, Retrohime, Serial Isle, Leia Pico, Newtaf, Patrick Davison, Arborix, Lisette MT, June, Dr. Yola McSwag, Graf G, Squid Goo, Joe, Vuggle Nugget, Annie, and Samir Zaran, as well as all the other names you're seeing on the screen right now.